All right, let's dive into Federico Garcia Lorca's Romancero Gitano. It's a collection of poems that's been around for ages, and people still can't get enough of it.
You're not kidding. It's amazing how relevant these poems still feel today, almost like Lorca had this uncanny ability to tap into something timeless.
Exactly. Our listener is ready to uncover the key themes, symbols, and all that good stuff that makes Romancero Gitano tick.
Well, I think it all starts with understanding the historical context. Published in 1928, just a few years before the Spanish Civil War, you can feel that tension simmering beneath the surface of the poems. It's like a snapshot of a society on the verge of upheaval.
Right, like a powder keg about to explode.
Huh.
So we've got this backdrop of pre-Civil War Spain, and then Lorca chooses to focus on the Gypsies. What drew him to this particular group, do you think?
Well, Lorca was deeply connected to Andalusian culture, and the Gypsies, or Roma people, were a part of that fabric. But they were also a marginalized group facing prejudice and discrimination. Lorca saw in them this spirit of freedom, this resistance against societal norms that really resonated with him.
So he was giving a voice to those who are often silenced. And by focusing on them, he was also commenting on the larger social and political climate of Spain at the time.
Precisely. It was a way to explore those universal themes of freedom, oppression, and the search for identity, but within a specific cultural context.
It's fascinating how he chose this particular group to embody those larger themes. So, okay, we have the historical context. We have this understanding of the Gypsies as symbols of resistance.
Yeah.
But what about the poems themselves? What are some of the key themes that Lorca explores in Romancero Gitano?
Oh, he covers so much ground. You've got doomed love, fate, violence, passion, and then there's this incredible use of symbolism that weaves everything together.
Yeah, the symbolism, we've got to talk about that.
Yeah.
I remember being really struck by how Lorca uses the moon, for example. It's this recurring image throughout the collection, but it doesn't always have the same meaning, does it?
Not at all. You hit on something really important there. The moon is a great example of how Lorca plays with duality. Sometimes it represents beauty and femininity. Other times it becomes this ominous presence, almost a harbinger of death.
Wow, that's so interesting. It's like he's saying that beauty and darkness, life and death, they're all intertwined. You can't have one without the other.
Exactly. And that tension, that interplay between light and shadow, is a hallmark of Lorca's work.
Okay, so we've got these big themes: love, fate, violence. We've got these recurring symbols like the moon. I'm ready to dive into some of the specific poems. What ballad do you think best exemplifies those elements we've been talking about?
Well, Romance Somnambulo, the sleepwalking ballad, is a great place to start. It's one of Lorca's most famous poems, and for good reason. It perfectly encapsulates that blend of beauty, tragedy, and symbolism that we've been discussing.
I remember reading that one and being completely mesmerized by it. It's haunting. Can you walk me through it a bit? What are some of the key things we should be paying attention to?
Well, first, there's the setting. A young woman sleepwalking on a rooftop. Right away, Lorca creates this atmosphere of mystery and unease.
Yeah, you get this sense that something bad is going to happen. It's like the whole poem is building towards this inevitable tragedy.
Exactly. And then there's the color green. Lorca uses it throughout the poem, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of symbolizing life and growth, it takes on a more sinister meaning.
Ah, I see. It's like he's twisting something familiar, something we usually associate with positive things, and turning it into something dark and foreboding.
Precisely. And the way he repeats the word green throughout the poem, it emphasizes that sense of longing and foreshadowing. It's like the color itself becomes a character, almost like this ominous presence that's guiding the girl towards her fate.
And that ending, it's left so open-ended. You don't know for sure what happens to the girl, but you're left with this feeling of loss.
Right. It's implied that she falls from the rooftop, but Lorca never explicitly states it. He leaves it up to the reader to fill in the gaps.
And it's that ambiguity, that lingering question that makes the poem so powerful. You're left thinking about it long after you finish reading it. It's like the tragedy is even more potent because it's not explicitly spelled out.
I think you're absolutely right.
Okay, so we've got Romance Somnambulo, where green, this symbol of life, becomes associated with doom, and the sleepwalking girl is drawn towards a tragic end. What other ballad do you think showcases that interplay between beauty, danger, and fate that seems to run through so much of Romancero Gitano?
Well, how about Prendimiento de Antonito el Camborio en el Camino de Sevilla? In English, that's the arrest of Antonito el Camborio on the road to Seville.
Okay, that title definitely sets the stage for something intense. Tell me more about Antonito. What makes his story so compelling?
Well, Antonito is a young gypsy, described by Lorca as incredibly handsome, but he gets betrayed and killed by 4 civil guards. It's a really stark portrayal of the vulnerability of the Gypsies, how even something as simple as walking down a road can be dangerous for them.
And it's not just dangerous, it's fatal in this case. I remember that line about Antonito walking with 3 shadows and another shadow walked him. Chilling.
Exactly. It's like Lorca is using those shadows to foreshadow Antonito's doom, suggesting that he was always walking towards this tragic end.
Right. And the way Lorca describes his death, it's so matter-of-fact, so unemotional. It's like he's highlighting the casual cruelty with which the authorities treat the Gypsies.
It's almost like he's saying that this kind of violence is just a fact of life for them.
It's a powerful statement for sure. So we've got these 2 ballads, Romance Sonambulo, with the sleepwalking girl drawn to her fate, and Pedimiento de Antonito el Camborio, where this young gypsy meets a brutal end. Both highlight the precariousness of life for the Gypsies, the ever-present threat of violence. But Romancero Gitano isn't just about death and tragedy, is it? There must be some lighter themes woven into the collection as well, right?
You're absolutely right. Lorca also explores themes of love, desire, even defiance, and he does it in such a captivating way.
Well, that's a relief. I'm all for exploring the darker side of things, but I don't want to get too bogged down in doom and gloom. What poem would you say best represents that exploration of love and desire?
La Casada Infiel, which translates to the unfaithful wife, comes to mind immediately. It's a really interesting exploration of a forbidden romance between a married woman and a young gypsy.
Ah, that's the one where they meet by the riverbank, right? What makes this ballad so intriguing?
Well, for one, it's told from the woman's perspective. You get this intimate glimpse into her thoughts and feelings, and it's clear that she's not portrayed as a victim or a villain.
So it's not just a simple tale of infidelity. There's something deeper going on here.
Exactly. She makes a conscious choice to embrace her desires, and Lorca doesn't shy away from the sensuality of the encounter. The language she uses is incredibly vivid, almost like you're right there with them, feeling the heat of their passion.
It sounds like he's pushing the boundaries, challenging the social norms of the time.
He definitely is. It's a bold move, especially considering the context of Spain in the late 1920s. And what's interesting is that even though the poem ends with the woman returning to her husband, she's clearly changed by the experience.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's like she's had this taste of freedom, this glimpse into a world outside of her everyday life. And even though she goes back, she can never fully erase that experience.
Exactly. It raises all these questions about the nature of freedom and desire. Can we ever truly be free if we're constantly constrained by societal expectations? And what happens when we choose to defy those expectations, even for a fleeting moment?
Wow, those are some heavy questions. It's amazing how Lorca can take something seemingly simple, like an affair, and turn it into this profound meditation on freedom and desire. And it all ties back to that idea of the Gypsies representing this fight for freedom and recognition.
It does, doesn't it? It's like he's showing us how those themes play out on a personal level within the confines of societal expectations.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the key themes that Lorca explores in Romantica Gitano. Love, fate, violence, and desire. And we've touched upon 3 very different ballads that exemplify those themes. But you mentioned earlier that Lorca uses a lot of symbolism in his work. What are some of the key symbols we should be paying attention to as we delve deeper into Romancero Gitano?
Well, we've already touched on the moon and its duality, but there are so many others that are equally important. For example, horses appear throughout the collection, often representing freedom and vitality.
Oh, that makes sense. Horses. They're powerful, untamed. I can see how Lorca would use them to symbolize that spirit of freedom that he so admires in the Gypsies.
Exactly. It's a stark contrast to the civil guards, who often represent the restrictions of society. It's like he's setting up this battle between freedom and constraint, between passion and conformity.
I like that. It's this constant push and pull that runs through so much of his work. And what about knives? I remember seeing them pop up quite a bit in the poems.
Knives are another important symbol. They represent violence, but also honor and fate. They often appear in moments of heightened emotion, adding to that sense of danger and tension that permeates so many of the ballads.
It's like the knife represents both the beauty and the danger inherent in the Gypsy way of life. It can be a tool for protection, but it can also be a weapon. It's a constant reminder that life is fragile.
That's a really insightful observation. And then, of course, you have water.
Water. Now, that seems like it could have multiple interpretations.
Exactly. Water can symbolize life, purity, transformation, but it can also be associated with danger and even death, especially when it comes to drowning. Think about the young girl in Romance Somnambulo who seemingly falls to her death. It's a haunting image that captures the duality of water perfectly.
Right. It's beautiful, but also incredibly dangerous. It's like Lorca is reminding us that nothing is ever entirely one thing or the other. There's always this interplay between opposing forces.
You've got it. And that's what makes his work so rich and complex.
Okay, so we've got these layers of symbolism. The moon, horses, knives, water, all working together to create this vivid tapestry of the Gypsy experience and explore those larger themes of love, fate, violence, and desire. It feels like we've started to piece together the puzzle of Romancero Gitano, but I can tell there's so much more to uncover.
You're definitely right about that. We've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's so much more to explore in terms of the specific ballads, the nuances of Lorca's language, and the historical and cultural context that shaped his work.
Well, I'm definitely ready to dive deeper, and I know you have some fascinating insights to share about some of the other key ballads in the collection. Let's come back and continue our exploration of Romancero Gitano.
I'm excited to keep going. There's so much more to discover.
Okay, so much to unpack from those first few ballads. But before we move on, I think we should circle back to Romance Somnambulo for a minute. There's just so much to dig into there.
I agree. It's a poem that keeps revealing new layers the more you explore it. Remember how we talked about Lorca's masterful use of imagery? Well, Romance Somnambulo is a prime example.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like he paints this vivid picture with words. I mean, even the title itself, Sleepwalking Ballad, evokes such a strange and surreal atmosphere.
Right, you're immediately drawn into this dreamlike state, this world where the boundaries between reality and fantasy are blurred.
And then there's that recurring image of the green wind. It's both beautiful and unsettling at the same time. What do you make of that?
I think the green wind functions on multiple levels. On the surface, it's a simple meteorological phenomenon, but Lorca uses it to represent something much more profound. It becomes this symbolic force that carries with it the weight of fate and foreshadows the tragic events to come.
So it's not just about the wind itself, but what it represents. And speaking of representations, what about the color green? We typically associate green with life, growth, vitality. But Lorca seems to be using it in a very different way.
Exactly. That's one of the things that makes Romance Somnambulo so captivating. Lorca takes something familiar, something we usually associate with positive connotations, and twists it, turning it into something ominous and foreboding.
It's like he's saying that even in the midst of beauty, there's this underlying current of danger. It's a reminder that life is fragile, unpredictable.
I think you're right on the mark with that interpretation. And the way he repeats the word green throughout the poem, green how I want you green, green wind, green branches. It's almost like an incantation, emphasizing that sense of longing, that pull towards something both desirable and dangerous.
And then, of course, there's that ambiguous ending. We never find out definitively what happens to the sleepwalking girl, but it's heavily implied that she falls to her death.
Yes, and I think that ambiguity is part of what makes the poem so haunting. Lorca leaves it up to the reader to fill in the gaps, to imagine the girl's fate. And that act of imagining, of grappling with the uncertainty, makes the tragedy all the more potent.
It's like he's inviting us to participate in the creation of the poem, to become active participants in the unfolding of the tragedy. And in a way, that makes the experience even more unsettling, because we're forced to confront the darkness, the unknown, head on.
Precisely. We can't shy away from it. And that, I think, is a testament to Lorca's genius. He doesn't give us easy answers. He challenges us to think, to feel, to confront the complexities of life and death.
Okay, so we've delved even deeper into Romance Somnambulo, and it's clear that this ballad is full of rich symbolism and complex themes. Now, I'm curious to explore another ballad that we touched on earlier, Prendimiento de Antonito del Camborio en el Camino de Sevilla, or The Arrest of Antonito el Camborio on the Road to Seville. This one really stuck with me because of how it portrays the casual brutality that the Gypsies often faced.
It's a chilling ballad, for sure. And I think it's important to remember that it's not just about Antonito's individual fate. It's a reflection of the larger systemic oppression that the Roma people endured.
Right. It's like Lorca is using this specific story to highlight a broader social issue. And he does it so effectively by contrasting Antonito's beauty, his vitality, with the stark brutality of his death.
You've hit on a key element there. Lorca describes Antonito as having olive skin and eyes of cold silver, emphasizing his youthfulness and attractiveness. But then he juxtaposes that with the harsh reality of his fate, killed by 4 civil guards.
And the way he describes it is so matter-of-fact, so devoid of emotion. It's almost like he's saying that this kind of violence is so commonplace, so normalized, that it's no longer even shocking.
Exactly, and that's what makes it all the more disturbing. It's a stark indictment of the society that allows such injustice to occur. And remember those lines about the shadows? He walked with three shadows, and another shadow walked him.
Oh, yes. Those lines are so haunting. They add this layer of inevitability to Antonito's fate. It's like he was always walking towards his death, and those shadows were a premonition of what was to come.
Right, it's almost like the shadows represent the forces that are conspiring against him, the societal structures that are working to keep him down.
And yet there's also a sense of defiance in his story. Even though he's ultimately killed, he doesn't go down without a fight. He embodies that spirit of resistance that Lorca so admired in the Gypsies.
You're absolutely right to point that out. Even in the face of oppression, there's this spark of defiance, this refusal to be completely subjugated. And that, I think, is a powerful message that resonates throughout Romancero Gitano.
It's like Lorca saying that even though life can be brutal and unfair, there's still this inherent beauty and strength in the human spirit, this will to survive, to resist, to find moments of joy and connection, even in the darkest of times.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it leads us perfectly into our discussion of La Casada Infiel, or the unfaithful wife. This ballad explores a forbidden romance between a married woman and a young gypsy, and it's a fascinating counterpoint to the tragic fates of the sleepwalking girl and Antonito.
It's like we're moving from the realm of darkness and despair into a world of passion and desire. And what's interesting is that, once again, Lorca chooses to tell the story from a woman's perspective, giving us this intimate glimpse into her thoughts and feelings.
Yes. And she's not portrayed as a victim or a villain, but as a complex individual who makes a conscious choice to step outside the boundaries of her prescribed life.
Right, she's not just going through the motions, she's actively seeking something more, something that fulfills her on a deeper level.
And it's clear that this encounter with the young gypsy is transformative for her. It's not just about physical passion, it's about a kind of awakening, a realization that there's more to life than what society dictates.
And I love how Lorca uses the setting of the riverbank at night to create this atmosphere of secrecy and transgression. It's like they've stepped outside of time and space into a world where societal norms don't apply.
It's their own little world, a space where they can be free, even if it's just for a fleeting moment.
And even though the woman ultimately returns to her husband, we know that she's been irrevocably changed by the experience. She's had a taste of freedom, and she'll never be the same again.
I agree. It raises some interesting questions about the nature of freedom and whether it's something that can ever be fully attained, especially within the constraints of society and expectations.
It's like Lorca is suggesting that true freedom might lie in those moments where we dare to break the rules, to follow our desires, even if it means risking everything. And that ties back to the Gypsies representing this constant struggle for freedom and recognition, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's like he's showing us how that struggle plays out on both a personal and a societal level. And it's through those individual stories, those moments of defiance and transgression, that we can glimpse the possibility of something more, something beyond the confines of our prescribed roles.
So we've moved from the tragedy of Romanzo Sonambulo and Prendimiento de Antonito el Camborio to this exploration of forbidden love and the search for freedom in La Casada Infiel. And what's remarkable is that all three of these ballads, despite their vastly different narratives, are deeply intertwined. They all contribute to Lorca's larger exploration of love, fate, violence, and the human condition.
And they all showcase his incredible talent for using language, imagery, and symbolism to create these powerful and evocative poems that continue to resonate with readers almost a century later. But we've only just scratched the surface. There are so many other fascinating ballads in this collection, each with its own unique insights and nuances.
Well, I'm ready to keep exploring. What other treasures await us in Romancero Gitano?
Oh, there's so much more to discover. We haven't even touched on Lorca's use of nature imagery, the way he weaves together themes of violence and beauty, or the historical and cultural influences that shaped his work. I'm excited to delve into all that with you.
Back for more Romancero Gitano. You know it's a good deep dive when we're on part 3 and still feel like there's so much left to say.
Right. It's incredible. We've talked about the poems themselves, but I think it's time to zoom out a little. Look at the bigger picture. How has Romancero Gitano impacted, well, everything?
I love that idea. It's not just a book on a shelf, right? It's gone out into the world. So how has Romancero Gitano influenced art, culture, even our conversations about identity today?
Well, first off, let's talk about poetry. Lorca was a game changer. He took these traditional Spanish forms and infused them with this modernist sensibility. Think vivid imagery, symbolism, just this raw outpouring of emotion, but crafted so carefully.
So it's like he was honoring the past while pushing poetry forward at the same time. No wonder other poets were inspired by him.
Exactly. And it wasn't just poets. Think about music, dance, theater. Romancero Gitano has been adapted into countless performances. You've got flamenco interpretations, modern dance pieces, even operas.
It's wild to imagine Lorca back in the 1920s, picturing a ballet based on The Unfaithful Wife. But that's the power of his work, right? The themes are so universal they can be expressed in so many different art forms.
Absolutely. And then there's the impact on how we view Gypsy culture. Remember, Lorca was writing at a time when the Roma people faced a lot of prejudice and misunderstanding. His work helped to humanize them, to showcase their rich traditions and the challenges they faced.
He didn't shy away from the harsh realities, though, right? It wasn't just this romanticized version of gypsy life.
Nope, not at all. Lorca was committed to portraying the Gypsies authentically. He celebrated their vibrancy and resilience, but also acknowledged the discrimination and marginalization they experienced.
And that makes his work so powerful. It's about empathy and understanding. And those are qualities we need now more than ever, right?
Couldn't agree more. The themes of Romancero Gitano, the search for identity, the fight for recognition, the struggle against oppression, they resonate so deeply with the conversations we're having today about social justice and inclusion. It's amazing how a collection of poems from almost a century ago can still feel so timely and relevant.
It's like Lorca had this uncanny ability to tap into something timeless, something that speaks to the human experience no matter what era you're living in. But I have to admit, when you first start reading Romancero Gitano, it can be a little overwhelming. There's so many layers of meaning, so much symbolism. Where do you even begin to unpack it all?
Well, I always tell people not to overthink it. The most important thing is to just dive in, experience the language, the imagery, let yourself be swept away by the emotions Lorca evokes.
It's like jumping into a pool.
Yeah.
You can't really learn to swim by standing on the sidelines. You just got to take the plunge and trust that you'll figure it out along the way.
Exactly, and I think that's what makes Romancero Gitano so rewarding. It's a journey of discovery. The more you explore, the more you uncover. And even after reading it multiple times, you're bound to find new insights, new layers of meaning that you hadn't noticed before. It's like a gift that keeps on giving.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listener will take away from exploring Romancero Gitano with us?
I hope they'll be inspired to experience it for themselves, whether it's reading the poems, seeing a performance, listening to a musical adaptation. Just go for it. Let Lorca's words wash over you and see what sparks ignite in your imagination.
I love that because ultimately, art is about connection, right? It's about finding those universal truths that bind us together, even across time and space. And Romancero Gitano is a powerful testament to that ability of art to transcend boundaries and connect us to something larger than ourselves. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey.